Today, we're diving into a question that is, thousands of years old, but it feels like it could have been written just yesterday. And that question is, why do we keep repeating our mistakes?
Yeah, seriously, why do we repeat the same mistakes? You know what I'm talking about. It's that same argument you have over and over, that same bad habit you just can't kick, that same lapse in judgment. It is probably one of the most frustrating parts of being human, right? Well, it turns out we are in some very, very old company on this one. So, to really get to the bottom of this, we're actually going to look at a 4,000-year-old case study from the book of Genesis. And one writer, a guy named Keith Krell, he summed it up perfectly. He called it a classic case of been there, done that. And that's a perfect lead-in to our first section, which we're calling embarrassing reruns. Let's be honest, we've all got them. We all have that one thing, right? That one mistake, that old habit, that reoccurring failure that just keeps popping up. The source material for this has this absolutely brilliant analogy. It says it's like a piece of furniture you keep hitting your shin on. You know it's there, you've mapped out the room in your head, you think you finally learned how to avoid it, and then, bam, you do it again. All right, so let's get into our case study and see how this whole thing plays out with one of history's most famous figures. We're going to talk about Abraham's déjà vu. Okay, so here's the setup. Our story kicks off with Abraham packing up his camp from a place called Mamre. He heads south and ends up settling in a city called Gerar. Now, you gotta understand, this was Philistine territory, a totally new and, let's be real, potentially dangerous place for a wealthy outsider like him to just show up. And here is where things get, well, kind of shocking. Because Abraham has been in this exact situation before. Like 20 years earlier, down in Egypt, he got scared that the Pharaoh would kill him to get to his beautiful wife, Sarah. So what did he do? He lied. He said, "She's my sister." Fast forward 2 decades, now he's in Gerar, he's afraid of King Abimelech, and he pulls the exact same lie. And the result? You guessed it, the exact same thing happens. Sarah gets taken into the ruler's harem. It is a literal carbon copy of his previous failure. So the big question here is why? Why would a man who had this long history with God for decades repeat such a disastrous mistake? To understand that, we have to look at what we're calling the anatomy of a sin. And to really wrap our heads around the self-destructive nature of these kinds of repeating failures, the source material shares this incredibly powerful, really old Eskimo story about how you kill a wolf. Now, fair warning, it's a pretty grim story, but it's so insightful. Here's how it goes. A hunter takes a razor-sharp knife, coats the blade in animal blood, and then lets it freeze solid. Then he does it again and again, adding layer after layer, until the blade is completely hidden inside what's basically a popsicle of frozen blood. Then he takes this thing and plants it, blade up, right in the snow. And here's the tragic part. A wolf comes along, smells the blood, and starts licking the bait. The more it licks, the more it craves the taste. Its licking gets more and more frantic until it finally wears through the layers of frozen blood and hits the sharp blade. The blade cuts its tongue. But, and this is the key, in its bloodlust, the wolf doesn't even notice. It just thinks it's getting more of the reward. It starts drinking its own lifeblood, satisfying its thirst by literally destroying itself until it just bleeds to death in the snow. That horrifying, tragic cycle, well, it actually has a name. In the Bible, it's called a besetting sin. It's that one particular weakness, that fault that we're just naturally inclined toward. The book of Hebrews describes it as the sin that so easily entangles us, the one that keeps tripping us up over and over again. So what was Abraham's besetting sin? What was his frozen knife? Well, this quote from a commentator named Warren Wiersbe just absolutely nails it. He said, Abraham stopped asking what is right and began asking what is safe, and this led to his downfall. See, his recurring failure was all rooted in fear. The second he felt unsafe, he threw integrity out the window and went for self-preservation, even when he knew that exact strategy had blown up in his face before. But this is where the story takes this really ironic twist. Just when we're laser-focused on the failure of God's chosen prophet, the guy who's supposed to be the villain of the story, he steps up and becomes its moral center. This next part is all about the king's integrity. So before King Abimelech can, consummate his new marriage to Sarah, God himself steps in. He comes to the king in a dream with this incredibly stark warning. You are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman. Talk about a wake-up call. This divine intervention just slams the brakes on the whole disaster and pivots the spotlight directly onto the king.
So how does the king react? He responds with integrity. So what do we even mean by that word, integrity? Well, according to the source material, it's soundness, it's sticking to a moral code, it's being completely sincere and honest, and here's the really crucial part. It's the commitment to do the right thing, to be upright, even when the people around you are totally in the wrong.
And this brings us to the great central irony of the whole story. Just think about this for a second. Abimelech, a so-called pagan king, has more integrity in this moment than Abraham, God's prophet. It's wild. Abimelech pleads his innocence, he even questions God's fairness, and then he immediately tries to make everything right. Meanwhile, Abraham is just kind of stuck, caught in a lie that he created entirely out of his own fear.
You know, the historical context here is actually fascinating. Gerar was a Philistine city, right? And a lot of scholars believe Abimelech wasn't even a personal name. They think it was a royal title, kind of like how Pharaoh was the title for the ruler of Egypt. And if that's true, it suggests that the king's appeal to his own integrity wasn't just a personal thing. It might have been a reflection of a whole cultural standard of justice, a standard that Abraham, in his panic, completely failed to see.
Okay, so let's recap. Abraham failed. The king showed integrity. God stepped in. So how does this whole mess get resolved? That's what we're going to cover in our final section, grace over failure. Now, the story is super clear on this point. Even though God intervenes, grace is not a free pass. Abraham's lie had very real, very serious consequences. It damaged his own character, his integrity, it wrecked his testimony in front of the people of Gerar, and you can only imagine what it did to his relationship with Sarah. It even brought some kind of plague of barrenness on Abimelech's whole household until this thing got sorted out. So, you might be asking, if there are all these consequences, then where's the grace? Well, there's this quote from Juan Carlos Ortiz that just illustrates it perfectly. He says that living a life of faith, it's like being on a trapeze. And he asks, what happens when we slip? The net is surely there. See, that's what grace is. It isn't permission to be sloppy and careless up on the trapeze. It's the safety net that catches us when we inevitably fall. God didn't just abandon Abraham. He protected him, and he protected Sarah from the worst possible consequences of his failure. The net doesn't stop the fall from hurting, but it makes sure the fall isn't the end of the story. And that brings us right back to where we started. This story about Abraham, it isn't just some ancient tale. It's a mirror, and it forces every one of us to ask a really personal question. So let me ask you, what's your piece of furniture? What's that thing you keep whacking your shin on over and over again? Because recognizing what it is, well, that's the first step to finally moving it out of the way for good.